stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Very good evening. It's 8 p.m. on Brazier for you tonight. Return of the jungle. Last night, the French government opened a new migrant centre in Calais that critics say will act as a magnet for asylum seekers. Will it? We'll discuss. Also, politics in peril. The former MP, George Galloway, joins me to discuss the threats now faced by MPs and why Scotland under the SNP is quite so woke. And remember or not, a survey suggests 4 out of 10 young people have no idea what Bonfire Night means. All that's coming up, but first the news update with Karen.
Thank you, Colin. These are your latest headlines. Greta Thunberg says COP26 has already failed. Speaking to thousands of young activists on a march through the centre of Glasgow, she demanded world leaders take real action to tackle climate change.
The COP has turned into a PR event where leaders are giving beautiful speeches and announcing fancy commitments and targets, while behind the curtains, the governments of the global north countries are still refusing to take any drastic climate action.
Lord Patel has been appointed the new chair of Yorkshire County Cricket Club following Roger Hutton's resignation. It's after former player Azim Rafiq accused the club of institutional racism. The club has been banned from hosting international and major matches for its handling of the claims. 2 other board members have also resigned. The chief executive of the ECB, Tom Harrison, confirmed the incident is being taken very seriously.
Strong action is being taken in response to this, where trust has been breached, where there is a fault line, where there are problems, and the message we're sending out is we are taking action and we will listen.
Labour and the Lib Dems will fight the upcoming North Shropshire by-election after Tory MP Owen Paterson resigned. Mr Paterson faced a 30-day Commons ban for breaching lobbying rules, but the government voted to block it before a U-turn was made. Education Secretary Nadim Zahawi says it was a mistake for the government to combine a vote on disciplinary procedures with an MP's suspension. The European Commission Vice President says he's disappointed by the UK's efforts to reach an agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Maros Sefcovic announced EU proposals to cut customs-related red tape by half. But he claims after a 3rd round of talks with Britain's Brexit Minister, Lord Frost, they are no closer to an agreement. Talks will continue in London next week. Richard Ratcliffe has told GB News it's unacceptable for Iran to take British citizens hostage on his 13th day of hunger strike outside the Foreign Office. His wife, Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, was jailed in Iran in 2016 after being accused of plotting to overthrow the government there. Mr Ratcliffe started the strike after his wife lost an appeal for freedom.
Hunger strike is a short-term tactic. British government, other governments tend to not respond to hunger strikes during them. So we will see what happens. We will see if we get another meeting with Liz Truss and so on. And then maybe we don't. I'm not planning on continuing this to the point where I end up in hospital and in a coma.
Well, you're right up to date now. Back to Brazier.
Too much of that graphic stuff going on there, isn't it? Now, good evening to you. The Mayor of Calais is describing as madness the opening last night of a new centre in her town that will house hundreds of migrants who are trying to reach Britain. The French government has set up the facility in spite of warnings that it will act as a magnet for migrants. It's already been dubbed Jungle Mark II. Well, it's the latest indication that the migrant emergency, if we can call it that, far from abating over the winter, is actually worsening. While the media and politicians decamp to Glasgow and COP26 this week, it does seem that at the other end of the country, a crisis is unfolding really unprecedented in its scale. If we were being charitable, we might say that's because there's a time lag between what we find out, perhaps, and precisely what's happening in the Channel days after the event. But only today, for instance, a picture fully clarifying of the utter chaos on the water on Wednesday. At one stage, it's now believed that almost 50 boats were in the Channel. Half of them made it to Britain. In all, 853 migrants arrived here on Wednesday. That is the highest ever number for a single day. But the number could have been double that. Another 22 boats never made it, along with 779 migrants who are forced back by conditions to the French coast. At least 3 migrants have drowned this week, and the influx of asylum seekers to the coastline has also led really to carnage on land. Yesterday, a high-speed train hit a group of Eritrean migrants who were on a rail route near Calais. One died and several were injured, some of them very seriously. Let's turn to our Home and Security editor, Mark White, to reflect on this week. And Mark, an extraordinary week, and one where, as I say, there's a time lag, which means that only really today are we finding out precisely what happened on Wednesday. But a story is emerging that would have been unthinkable 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes, and that's the worry, really, that the migrants are still coming across now in these small boats, pushed out by the criminal gangs, the people traffickers who are being paid thousands of pounds for putting these people onto small boats and shoving them into the Channel in very dangerous conditions. Now, we would normally see that the bulk of these people would come across the Channel in the summer, but last year really broke the mould in terms of we saw some boats still crossing during the winter months. Well, we're heading towards the winter months now. Conditions are far from ideal in the Channel, as they were, of course, on Wednesday, when effectively there was a full-scale emergency, particularly on the French side, which resulted in a number of people being drowned or having gone missing, boats capsizing. It was chaos for the French authorities, with more than 20 boats in trouble that they were responding to, because, as I say, the people traffickers now are pushing those people out in those boats, despite the fact that the conditions are not ideal in the Channel. There on Wednesday, it was fairly windy, choppy seas. There's a fast current often anyway within the Channel, and of course you've got all the wake that comes off the various boats that go through this very busy shipping lane. And that is the real concern now that both UK and French authorities have, Colin, that it is only a matter of time where we're not talking about 1 or 2 people on board these small boats who are drowning, but we're talking about many more than that if it happens out in the Channel and a bit further away from any kind of rescue help.
Mark, you mentioned the illegal people smugglers. They must be absolutely made up. They must be really chuffed to hear that there is to be another centre. In this case, it's a warehouse capable of housing 300 people, because that will act as a focal point, a magnet that will draw people to this particular part of Calais. It simplifies their job.
Yeah, certainly the Mayor of Calais, Natasha Bouchard, is not at all happy that there is this migrant centre that has been set up in the town. It's, at the moment, we're told, going to house 300. Well, that's nowhere near enough in terms of the capacity that's required. If you consider that just in one day there were more than 1,600 people who were on the water, it gives you an indication of the numbers that are out there. Now, this really stems from the jungle, the infamous Calais jungle a few years back, that at its height housed more than 10,000 people. The French authorities moved in, ripped up that jungle, and really have been on a mission ever since to regularly go in and raid and tear down these makeshift structures that the migrants erect while they wait for an opportunity to get across the channel. However, that means in doing that a lot of these people are now sleeping under underpasses. They're sleeping in the town centre in Calais as well. There's criminality there. There are items that are being stolen, boats that are being stolen and commandeered to come across the channel. So some real concern about that. So the French authorities dealing with that, and also a French priest who's been on a hunger strike for the last few weeks along with 2 local activists trying to get a solution to that problem, and the concerns have decided to go for these shelters to offer some temporary accommodation for those who are in that area, just to get them off the streets. It's not just in Calais though, it is taking place. These shelters are being erected in Dunkirk, in other parts of this region of northwest France, to deal with the immediate crisis there. But as you say, of course, perhaps that could be seen as something that is going to attract more people, knowing that there's a shelter. But I mean, I doubt it. People are heading there anyway, Colin, because they want to get across the channel.
And it's such a moral quandary, Mark. I mean, briefly, we've been here before. I mean, you mentioned the jungle, but actually we can go back further. I mean, I remember going to places like Songat, the old Red Cross warehouse there, and all these arguments were recycled and rehearsed then. And there was that constant tension between, on the one hand, wanting to do right by humanity and making the grand humanitarian gesture, but also in so doing, knowing that actually you would ultimately potentially make things worse, because you're then creating this magnet that draws many more people into harm's way. There's that constant tension.
Yeah, I mean, it seems unsolvable, really, in many respects. The British government is looking to go after, of course, the people smugglers, the criminal gangs that are profiting from this trade in humanity, but they're really not making that much in the way of inroads, despite the fact that they are arresting on a fairly regular basis individuals involved in this criminal enterprise. What's happening is, because it's so lucrative, other gangs are going in and they are filling the void that is created when one particular network is taken out of operation. It is creating, as far as the criminal gangs are concerned, millions and millions of euros in the course of a week. If you consider just 853 people in one day making it across the channel, paying, we're told, something like £5,000 a head, it is a very lucrative industry for the criminal networks.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. We were hoping to speak to Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, French commentator, about this story, to get that French perspective on things and what's happening particularly in Calais, and whether they notice it, what's going on in Calais and Paris. Some technical problems there, which we hope to fix and hope to talk to in a wee while. So in the meantime, let's tell you about thousands of students who across the country face another winter of disruption, but this time not because of the pandemic. Academic staff at 37 universities voted in favour of more strike action over cuts to their pension benefits. The University and College Union reported that the strikes could start before Christmas and last until next year. There were strikes by lecturers in 2018 and 2020. Joining me now, Oscar Lopez, economics student at the University of Sussex and a commentator on this type of thing. Oscar, thanks so much indeed for joining us. We appreciate it. I don't know how much you know about the actual source of the dispute itself. I know that there are problems about pay. This particular one is about pensions. I have to say, I mean, we're sort of generationally different, so we perhaps think a little bit differently about pensions. Mine's sort of a more immediate problem than it might be for you, Oscar. But compared to many people in the private sector, academics, even though they're complaining that they're going to be 35% worse off through this new pension deal, are a damn sight better off than many people in the private sector. What on earth is their beef then?
Well, this is the thing. I think that the first thing we have to say is that students have been used as political football by two interest groups, which is the university and obviously lecturers. The ones that are suffering most are students, right? So students, all they're asking for is a bit of representation, proper representation, and to be in the discussion. Because at the moment, you know, the rows are pretty political in terms of, you know, over pay and over cuts. But students want an education. That's what the majority of students want. At the moment, they're not getting that, and they haven't been getting that for about 3 years. When I was in my first year when I was at university, we had strikes from about this time of year till about January. Then we had COVID, then we had online learning. After online learning, we all thought it was going to go back to normal. It wasn't. Well, for my university it was, but other universities carry on doing online. And now we're getting to the position where we're going into another strike. So actually, in total, you think, well, actually, what's the point of being at university? And I think that's what a lot of students and a lot of young people going into university are going to start to think. What is the point of this? You're paying £9,000 a year to actually not be at university. You know, we may as well every single year pack up in November and go over Christmas.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Oscar, you've got no leverage. I share your pain. My eldest daughter of somebody I know very well is doing a master's degree at the moment. She signed up to it and paid and will be paying £18,000 for a year's study and a master's degree. And part of the attraction was that would also involve 5 months in Australia studying rocks there as part of a geology master's. But actually, when it comes to it, having just sort of waited for the cheque to clear, the university then say, well, actually, you know what, that Australia bit, that's not happening. And those lectures you thought would be in person, well, they'll be online. What a scam.
But the other thing is, you raise a good point, but the representation of what should be for students, National Uni students, aren't really doing a very good job representing students. These are people who, you know, without really any consultation with anyone, are going ahead and supporting the strikes. You think they're supposed to be standing up for the interest of students. How is it in the interest of students to have these strikes? So the actual representation, and you're right in saying that, you know, we don't have, you know, a lot of leverage, but the leverage that we should have is by the people that should be representing us, and they're just not. It's solely political, and I think what it shows you as well is that the way university is going, it's not what it's designed to be. It's people are going there to be activists on all sides of it, from students, from lecturers, and from the university. And you saw that as well with Kathleen Stock. I mean, for me, if you go to university, the main things you go to university is, you know, you go there first and foremost to, you know, to go to lectures, learn, to socialise, and be challenged on your thoughts. That's the whole point of university. And all of those things are going. Like, there is literally no point at the moment, because you won't get challenged in your thoughts because everything's in a bubble. And if you do get challenged, then that person's going to get sacked or going to have to resign or forced to resign, and their union won't support them. And you know, if you're lucky enough to actually go to lectures, well, you're going to have a strike for 3 months or something.
Yeah, the leverage is just not to go to university, isn't it? Oscar, we've got to leave it there. We've got a time crunch, but really appreciate your thoughts. Oscar Lopez there. Now, when it comes to the migrant crisis in the Channel, what is Emmanuel Macron thinking? There is no doubt the British government needs his cooperation to stop the boats leaving the French coast. But what's in it for the French president? He's at loggerheads with London over Brexit trade and fishing rights, as we've been reporting this week. His visit to COP26, that was cut short. And now we learn his government is allowing, as we said in the introduction, another migrant centre to be built in Calais, which his critics say is bound to act as a magnet for asylum seekers. So can Britain rely on Monsieur Macron to deal with the migrants, or help us deal with the migrants that are coming from France? Joining me now is Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, Paris-based journalist and political commentator. Thanks so much for joining us, Anne-Elisabeth. We appreciate your time. What is Macron's strategy here with regards to what's happening in Calais? Does he even care? I mean, I just wonder how much the travails of life in Pas-de-Calais for the people there trying to fix things matter at all if you're in a lovely upholstered salon in Paris and not too worried about migrant flows.
Well, the idea that they're going to build a new migrant center is essentially that we're going into winter, that the migrants are huddling on beaches, in streets, all over the coast, actually, and that even though they tried to get rid of shanty towns that had built themselves sort of organically, what they're trying to do in a place that would be controlled is to at least provide decent services rather than let people essentially die of exposure. It is not necessarily what the inhabitants of Calais want, because they have suffered this migrant crisis for several years. I must say that I've heard, and you may say that this is unfair, but I've heard people in Calais say, look, why should we bear all the brunt? Why don't the British clear the migrants in Dover? And you try to explain that there is the Treaty of Le Touquet, and the Treaty of Le Touquet provides for customs to be cleared on either side on the land of departure. But of course, we're not being invaded by, hundreds of thousands of Vikings suddenly coming over the channel from the other side. So it's a bit one-sided for the French.
The problem is, I mean, I was just talking to our correspondent who was invoking the memory of the jungle and some of the scenes that you're just touching on there about people sleeping under underpasses and all the rest of it. I do remember going to a meeting with Nicolas Sarkozy, who was then the Interior Minister, with his then opposite number, David Blunkett. It was going to be 15, 16, 17 years ago. That was then about the Red Cross Centre at Sangatte. And the conversation we've just had, you could press rewind, make us both a little bit younger, and it would exactly be the same conversation from 15 or 16 years ago. So nothing's moved on. And I find myself wondering, as others might, whether the solution to this ultimately is not for the UK to sort its border out, but for France to sort its border out. And that would require a more Eurosceptic France, perhaps a France that leans and inclines more to the views of those who are tacking to the right, including Michel Barnier, ironically, but particularly Eric Zemmour.
Well, you have two different things here, because at the end of the day, this is a European and Schengen area problem, because migrants come in at one end of the Schengen area, and most of the time it's places like Greece and Italy who've borne a much heavier load than we have or you have. And then there's free circulation of people. Now, if France decided to end free circulation of people, that would be a declaration of war to Europe, and it's the last thing that Emmanuel Macron wants to do. He aspires to become the leader of Europe de facto. But it's also something that is more difficult to sort of arrange, essentially because we're talking about crises that have been going on for years. The appalling conditions, I'm really using the expression, of centres, migrant centres in France were not entirely by chance. I mean, to put it bluntly, you can also say that France left migrants to rot many times, in a sense, to do exactly what you were mentioning earlier, which is to not make the place more attractive. The general feeling on the Bush telegram, if you want, is that France is not a very welcoming place for migrants. It's not especially sort of humane or good way of treating things, and probably the answer would be sort of better borders at the borders of the Schengen area. I'm not saying that this is something that can be solved straight away.
No, but just on the point about the humanity of the thing, I mean, this is always the problem, isn't it? That you could argue, the Australian view on this was we'll have some short-term pain and we'll get dreadful headlines all around the world. People accuse us of being the most beastly, inhuman politicians, but in setting an example that says if you try and come to this country, you will be severely dealt with and you will not be allowed in, and you will not have a future as an Australian citizen. And there was some short-term pain there, to put it bluntly. The long-term effect was that some of the scenes that you're describing of people suffering, there were far greater numbers of them potentially suffering had the situation not been dealt with. I'm trying to draw an analogy with the erection of a new camp in Calais. If you build it, they will come. If you stop them, you'll have some short-term pain, but you will not have anything like the numbers that you will get. It's this tension between short-term pain and long-term gain.
I see what you're driving, and I think it's sensible. I know Australia. I think it makes sense, but that would take pan-European, pan-EU resolve that does not exist. And that is something that is not going to be achieved by bits and pieces. We had for a long time no specific camp. You had NGOs of doing their best to help migrants piecemeal, and then to put them onto skiffs to cross the channel, because they knew that the law of the sea meant that you don't let people drown. And I don't think that just not building this present camp is going to change much of the general situation. I'm not saying that this is being welcomed, and certainly this is going to be fodder in the election. It's not the main fodder, because we don't see this as existential to the extent that you see it in Britain, mostly because they really feel that they will be better treated in Britain. And, the French are also saying, why do the Brits offer so often housing benefits and general benefits and help in ways that actually does not exist so much in France? They are making themselves as a magnet. We are not ourselves the magnet. We're just the place where they have to go through in order to get to Britain. And that, too, is a decision that you possibly have to take.
And Elizabeth Moutet, appreciate your time, and thanks for making the technology work eventually. Thanks a lot. After the break, isn't it something to do with knives and forks? The astonishing survey which reveals just how many people know next to nothing about Guy Fawkes and Bonfire Night.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints, over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. And we do remember, don't we? For 400 years and more, Britons have lit bonfires and launched fireworks into the chill November skies to remember our most famous and least successful act of domestic terrorism. Depressingly, the folk memory of Guy Fawkes and his fellow traitors is wearing thin. A survey this week showed that 4 in 10 Brits have no idea about the origins of Bonfire Night. A quarter think it's a pagan festival. A tenth think Guy Fawkes is a fictional character, only fractionally more that than the number who thought that he gave his name to the fork, as in knives and forks. The poll wasn't one of those silly surveys dreamed up by a bored PR executive and involving a sample that included a handful of respondents, some of them made up. No, this was fairly robust stuff, 1,500 people and old enough to know better. These were not kids, they were aged between 16 and 29. It's all of a piece, I'm afraid, with where we are as a society. In our rush to embrace other cultures, other histories, other identities, we risk the neglect of our own. There is a growing suspicion that anything that happened beyond living memory is somehow irrelevant to modern Britain, or worse still, tells a story that is, dread word, problematic. But for a society to have social cohesion, it needs foundational stories. That's difficult when a large and growing part of the population have ancestors who were not in the UK when palace guards stumbled upon Guido minding his gunpowder. The temptation has been to find new stories, new characters to tell our national story, and that often involves slaying the old to make way for the new. Out go the old white men, Churchill, Gladstone, Nelson, Newton. In comes Mary Seacole. It's easier to sell a national story if it looks less like Brideshead Revisited and more like Bridgerton. And the truth is that if you apply the corrective lens of modern sensibilities, there is almost nothing from our history which someone won't find objectionable. Even the gunpowder plot. It sought to rid our country of its monarchy, its aristocracy, its politicians, its established church. There are quite a few alive today who would applaud such a revolutionary manifesto. Even the idea of lighting bonfires, releasing all that carbon into the atmosphere, all those fireworks scaring the animals, will offend someone somewhere. But Guy Fawkes isn't Cecil Rhodes. He's not being actively airbrushed from our history. He's been forgotten about as a byproduct of an educational system which simply chooses to prioritise other narratives. There are only so many hours in the school day, and where do you find the time to explain the ways of medieval Britain or the Civil War if the syllabus is groaning under the weight, say, of Black History Month, which ended a few days ago, or if children are encouraged to focus on learning about the very latest twist in identity politics. Yesterday, for instance, we told you about the primary school in Edinburgh, where boys as young as 3 are being urged to attend a class for a day wearing a skirt to promote equality. The people who run our culture, the media, the NGOs, the charities, the museums, the arts, they subscribe to the laudable idea that history must be inclusive. The objective ignorance, or I should say importance, of an event or person now matters less than whether they can be shoehorned into a story of diversity. Guy Fawkes hasn't been cancelled, but nor can his life and death be presented in a way that makes all Britons feel he's relevant to their life right now. And so he begins his slow, posthumous march towards obscurity, aided by a culture which aids and abets this strange mania for amnesia. That's tonight's Brazier Angle. Joining me now, the author and journalist Tim Stanley. Tim, I do hope you can cheer me up. You know, I got to the end of that and thought, my Brazier, you've really depressed... I've depressed myself just reading that, and needlessly probably. Make us jollier if you can.
I think what you've described is historical illiteracy, but the interesting thing to me is that the tradition of Guy Fawkes and Bonfire Night is still going on. In fact, it's happening outside my window right now, and it's terrified my dog, and he's curled up on my lap. He's trying to escape it. So when you think about it, it's an example of an evolving tradition. Because initially, it started very soon. Excuse me, I've got a cold. It started very soon after the plot, about a year after. It was turned into a public holiday. And it was initially a celebration of divine providence, that the king, specifically the Protestant king, had managed to survive this plot. And for the next few hundred years, it was an explicitly sectarian festival. It was about the triumph of Protestantism over Catholicism. Mm. If anything, it began to fade in popular memory in the Victorian era, in part because of Catholic emancipation. It was just seen as a less relevant festival. And it just slightly fell away, partly as England became less religious. If anything, it seems to have been somewhat revitalized. And I was astonished when I was reading my local advert for the local bonfire that they had provided a potted history that was almost explicitly sectarian, not in intent, but in the narrative, about Catholic fanatics. Right, by Catholic, and the thing is, speaking as a Catholic fanatic, I couldn't disagree with anything they said. So the tradition is still there, but the interesting thing for me is the traditions are still around us. We still have Easter, we still have Christmas. The question is, do people understand? Do they understand what it is they're doing? And one reason why they might struggle to is because the country has changed so dramatically that some of these past events might just seem rather alien. I mean, sometimes Guy Fawkes is presented as an assault upon British democracy because it's Parliament. That might be what people assume is what it's about. It's really not at all. It's part of a religious war. This used to be a country where people believed in God very sincerely, and there was a real sectarian divide between Catholic and Protestant. And it might just be hard to explain to a post-Christian, post-spiritual society why people would do what Guy Fawkes tried to do.
And I wonder if they knew, even in 1605, that if this was to be a festival, if we can call it a festival that would enjoy longevity, its placement in the calendar would be vital. And in that they got lucky, I suppose, that at the beginning of November, it's getting darker, it's getting colder. I mean, without devolving to paganism, you can see that is one reason why it's endured, that people just quite like the idea of setting off fireworks on a dark night with winter coming. Hi, Tim. Well, Tim has been so stumped by my question, I think he's... Hi, Tim. Can you hear me?
I'm completely...
Can you hear us, Tim? It's a no. It's a no. Sorry, Tim. Oh, go on. You might be back.
Am I back? What was your question?
Well, I believe so long ago, I think I've forgotten it. I was just making the point that actually people like the festival because it ushers in winter, and on a cold, dark night, there's nothing better than the sight of a cheery bonfire. Oh. You know, one of those nights, isn't it? Tim Stanley. Lovely book he's written about tradition, which I recommend to you if you get the chance. Our thanks to him, but not the technology. Now, the man accused of fatally stabbing the Southend West MP, Sir David Amess, appeared in court today via video link. Ali Harbi Ali, who's 25, spoke only to confirm his name. He was told by a judge at the Old Bailey that a hearing at which he will enter a plea has been set for just before Christmas. The case has drawn attention to the threats received by politicians. And my next guest is no stranger to them. He is the high-profile former MP George Galloway, and this week he said on Twitter that he'd recently been on the receiving end of a death threat directed towards him and his family, which he'd passed on to police. We'll turn to George in just a second, but first for people who might be unfamiliar with him and his style of politics. This was him in 2005, appearing before a US Senate hearing into the invasion of Iraq.
I gave my heart and soul to stop you committing the disaster that you did commit in invading Iraq. And I told the world that your case for the war was a pack of lies. I told the world that Iraq, contrary to your claims, did not have weapons of mass destruction. I told the world, contrary to your claims, that Iraq had no connection to Al-Qaeda.
Well, it's fair to say George Galloway has made some enemies over the years, but lots of friends as well. Let's turn to him now to find out what these threats are all about. George Galloway, thanks for joining us. So good of you to spare us time on a Friday evening. What are these threats? What are they threatening?
Well, as a Roman Catholic, I don't actually celebrate Guy Fawkes Night because, of course, Guy Fawkes's action may well have been unconscionable. It was in the context of grim repression against Roman Catholics all over this country. So if you hear any fireworks outside, they're not from my family. The week has been extraordinary for me, but so has the year. Earlier in the year, a man pled guilty and was convicted of threatening to shoot me in the head. He did it 3 or 4 times in tweets that stayed up for many days, almost a week in one case. And he pled guilty, was convicted, and was given community service, which you may think rather lenient for threatening to shoot a candidate in an election in the head, and doing so multiple times. In fact, he might not have been charged at all, but he added the Conservative leader, Douglas Ross MP, to the roster of those he was going to shoot through the head latterly, and maybe that's what provoked some police action. And it's the double standards that I have decided to tackle today, Colin, in a legal action that I have begun in Dublin against Twitter for their negligence, their culpability in platforming what are effectively threats of terrorist action. The platform does precious little unless you really scream the house down to police these things. So you'll be hearing more. It'll have important ramifications because it goes to the heart of what Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and so on actually are. Are they publishers? In which case they are responsible for what goes on their platform. If someone were to threaten to stab me and my children, as happened on Twitter this week, on your show, then, God forbid, on your show, then GBNews would be culpable and responsible. So why are these social media platforms able to flaunt the responsibilities of a publisher? But I'm sure you don't want to talk about my travails all night.
Well, no, I'd be happy to. I'm
3 times.
That there's another side to the story which we may get from Twitter, as and when we put it to them, and the specifics of that particular complaint we'll leave for another time. And I do hope you'll come back and explain what pleasure otherwise you get from Twitter and that particular process. But I want to set this in a broader context, away from the specifics of this particular tweetee. And in particular, anybody who follows Scottish politics or the cause of unionism in this country will have noticed in recent years you've become a powerful advocate and a powerful voice for unionism. And thinking back to the referendum, IndyRef 1 of 2014, and there was a sort of, the cyber Nats, as they became known then, seemed to usher in, and we saw it magnified, you could argue, by Brexit subsequently, but seemed to usher in a new era of a very ad hominem politics, the politics of the personal, that was then given an additional twist by social media. And I'm not laying everything at the door of Cybernats and the SNP, of course I'm not. I'm just saying that it felt, and you must have felt particularly, that was when the wind changed direction a little bit.
Yes, it did, although it did coincide with the extraordinary growth of social media. So whether it was the medium or whether it was the message is, I suppose, a questionable issue. But the Brexit and Scottish nationalism have definitely caused tremendous division inside the country. I was for the Union and for Brexit, and of course fought my corner as fiercely as I could. What is happening, though, in Scotland for sure, is a kind of Northern Irish dimension coming into Scottish politics. A lot of the rhetoric and reduced to a kind of caricature of Union Jack waving, and the language of the Provisional IRA is often deployed on social media by nationalists, not necessarily by members of the SNP, though the SNP never condemn it. It's their policy never to condemn. The man who was going to shoot me in the head was a nationalist extremist. There's another man in court a week on Monday. He denies the charge, and I have to give evidence in that trial. This latest one, we don't know if that has anything to do with the Scottish question, but in Britain, politicians are definitely in the firing line.
Just hang on a sec. I just get slightly nervous when we use phrases like the man who threatened to shoot me in the head. That's a powerful charge. We'll leave that for others to decide. In quotes, that's
no, he was convicted of that. He pled guilty to that.
There's so much more I want to talk to you about, and in particular, we're talking about the SNP and whether there is a spirit of intolerance there. I was talking to the free speech campaigner Andrew Doyle only last night, and we were enumerating some of the draconian measures of recent years, whether it was the Named Person Act that sought to give every child in Scotland a named guardian, whether they were from a quote, vulnerable family or not, the idea that you can no longer have a dwelling defence when it comes to hate speech, stuff that would be thrown out of court in any other part of the UK, and you would expect when put to the electorate will be put out, would be tested to destruction as well. And yet the SNP remains in power. It can sometimes feel like Scotland is on a woke journey that feels pretty doolally. Why? Why is it happening?
Well, if you grew up in Scotland as I had, you wouldn't recognise that wokeness. It was not really present in the 35 years of my life that I spent living here before going to London to work. It isn't a particularly right-on, faddist, modish place, and yet it is represented in Parliament, Scottish Parliament, and in Westminster by a predominance of members of a party that literally could not be more woke. They boast that they have the gayest parliamentary group in the whole world. They have effectively outlawed the word woman. People go to chest feeding classes. Women's health is no longer described as such. Transvestites are taken into primary schools by SNP members of Parliament. It's truly extraordinary what has happened. But here's the rub. No more than 32% of the people of Scotland vote for that. They get into power, they win these seats because the pro-union side is divided three ways: Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat. And if you do the maths, it's quite obvious. If the union side cannot agree on a single candidate, on a single programme, then the separatist side are always going to win. By the way, I was referring to a case that has passed in the shooting through the head. The man pled guilty to that. He was convicted of that. He's still doing community service for that.
Understood. I'm glad you clarified that. George, just before you go, I'm being told to wind up, but I'm so curious about a couple of points. I remember being in your office when you were the Bradford West MP for the Respect Party. It must have been 15 years ago, and marvelling at your ability to go into a part of Britain which was deeply conflicted and had enormous problems by many measures. I remember thinking then what motivated you. And you mentioned a moment ago your Roman Catholicism. I mean, for a Catholic like me who still reads and occasionally used to write for the Catholic press, there was a sort of open question about your Catholicism or otherwise. You are still a practicing Catholic, are you?
I'm in good standing, or as good as I can, with the life I've led. Yes, of course, definitely. Once a Catholic, always a Catholic, Colin.
George, very nice of you to appear on the telly on GB News tonight. Really appreciate it. I hope we can talk to you again soon. George Galloway there. After the break, silenced or sacked? Another university professor claims to have been bullied for exposing her views on transgender people.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Well, earlier this week we told you about the dozen trans prisoners with convictions for violence or sexual crimes who've been moved to women's prisons in Scotland. It's happened over the last year and a half or so, and some campaigners are pretty unhappy about it. Of the 12, 11 self-identify as women, but they are biologically male. This is the sort of thing which got Jo Phoenix into hot water. Who's she? Well, Professor Phoenix is a criminologist at the Open University. She's taking the university to an employment tribunal. The professor claims she was bullied for suggesting that male-bodied prisoners should not be allowed into female prisons. A lot of people seem to think she has a point. She's managed to raise something like £80,000 in crowdfunding to bring that particular case. Well, joining me now, Brendan O'Neill from Spiked. Brendan, thanks so much for joining us on a Friday evening when you'd probably prefer to be outside watching fireworks with everybody else. I wondered, just before we get on to Professor Phoenix, if you just caught the end or the whole part of my interview with George Galloway there, and anything which particularly made your ears prick up, whether it was about maybe the free speech dynamics of Twitter or what he feels is the draconian manifesto of the SNP in Scotland. I mean, he remains a deeply engaging, at times almost hypnotic speaker, but is he talking any sense?
I think he's talking a lot of sense, yes. And I think the SNP has become an incredibly authoritarian party. They've turned Scotland into a kind of tin pot tyranny. It's, in many ways, it's the most authoritarian country in Western Europe, I think. You mentioned the named persons scheme, where the plan was that every child would have a social worker or a member of the state looking after them. That kind of fell apart eventually. They've also tried to ban certain chanting at football matches. There's the hate speech law. It really is a party that doesn't trust the Scottish people and wants to control almost every aspect of their lives. It's striking that the SNP would argue for independence while not trusting the people who it wants to be independent. So I think George Galloway makes a lot of sensible, correct points about the dangerous road that Scotland is going down under SNP rule.
It's not a road so very dissimilar from the rest of the UK when it comes to the rights or otherwise of people who've transitioned or even transitioned from one gender to another in terms of where they are accommodated within the criminal justice system. I mentioned those dozen prisoners, 11 of whom were simply self-identifying in Scotland. So I'm biologically a man, but I'm saying I'm a woman, and therefore I will be transferred to a women's prison, even though I've got convictions for violence, and that may involve sexual violence. You can see why that's leaving some female prisoners fairly traumatised.
Oh, absolutely. I think the idea that a biological male, some of whom have committed sexual offences, the idea that they should be housed in women's prisons, which are institutions full of vulnerable women at the lowest ebb of their lives, women who are very often victims of circumstance, I think that is just such a horrific suggestion. And I think most people would recognise that that was a horrific idea. I think it really is the nadir of woke campaigning, this idea that anyone who says they are a woman must be taken seriously, even a criminal, even a sexual offender, even potentially a rapist. So there's something deeply objectionable about the idea that men should be housed in women's prisons. And I think it does suggest that some elements of the trans movement have really lost their way and have really lost touch with morality.
And Professor Phoenix, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, you know far more about it, Brendan, than I do, but it seems to me that she's been in quotes bullied. She says she's been bullied for saying really what you just said to me.
Well, that's exactly the problem. You know, that it seems to me that lots of women who raise these concerns, lots of women in academia in particular, there's also Kathleen Stock at Sussex University, who was hounded out simply for believing in biological sex. Lots of women get treated appallingly if they argue that women need certain sex-based rights, and if they argue that women need their own spaces in which biological males should not be allowed to enter. Those women are treated really terribly. They are often no-platformed, they're censored, they're hounded, they're called every misogynistic name under the sun. So there's an element of misogyny, I think, to a certain wing of the trans movement. I've argued before that transgender campaigning looks like misogyny in drag, because it does end up hounding women, demonizing women, and punishing women simply for saying that women need certain rights. So what's happening to Jo Phoenix, the way she is now being hounded by elements of the trans movement, I think that really is a sign of the times, and it's become a risky business for women to say, we need our own spaces and men should not be allowed in.
Brendan O'Neill, good to talk to you as ever. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks.
Now, it's been recently confirmed that the Ministry of Education... No, we were going to do that story with Brendan. So let's move on to another story about China and tell you what's happening there. The Pentagon says China is rapidly increasing the size of its nuclear arsenal, assembling a far larger stockpile than previously thought. Washington now believes that the Red Army could have 700 deliverable, we'll discuss what that means in a moment, nuclear warheads by 2027. That is more than twice the number of warheads that the Pentagon, it's reported, believed the Chinese had as recently as a year ago. Well, joining me is Harry Kazianis, Senior Director of the Centre for the National Interest and former advisor on foreign policy during Senator Ted Cruz's presidential campaign. That was in 2016. Harry, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time. This is one heck of a misjudgment or underestimate of what China was doing. I mean, and it sort of seems to feel like part of an emerging narrative, which is that the Chinese Communist Party, the Red Army, seems to be able to get away with a sort of strategic sleight of hand, whether it's the scramjet, the hypersonic missiles, or indeed assembling a number of warheads that we couldn't possibly have guessed at.
Yeah, Colin. I mean, this is something that's been building for probably about 15 to 20 years, except the mainstream media just hasn't really been looking at it. You know, everybody's been so focused on the rise of Chinese economic power. Some consider China the biggest economy on earth, but now China is actually becoming in the position to become, maybe within 5 to 10 years, the most powerful military on the planet. And I think their nuclear weapons growth really points to this. For a long time, most scholars, people like myself, we all assumed China had about 200 to 300 deliverable nuclear warheads. In other words, warheads that could actually land on a target. But now the Chinese have been building, from what we can gather, a lot more nuclear weapons over a very, very short period of time, hiding them in silos, now actually showing them to US satellites, putting them on submarines, putting them on bombers. The growth of the Chinese nuclear arsenals is pretty vast. And it really points to the fact that why would the Chinese do this? Having a small nuclear arsenal usually means it's to deter an adversary from an invasion or an attack. But to build it this big, this fast, almost looks like the Chinese want to have some sort of first strike nuclear capability.
Wow.
And that's when this gets pretty scary.
Yeah, doesn't it just? I mean, absolutely basic question. Is it hard, when we look at Iran's travails in trying to do all the nuclear enrichment for its own nuclear program, we realise that actually just getting the warheads is technically tricky. Is it trickier than making the warheads deliverable, back to that word deliverable, having something to make sure they can reach US soil or, heaven forfend, UK soil?
Well, the Chinese have been working on this for a long time. I mean, they have warheads right now that have a capability called MERV. In other words, long story short, basically taking a nuclear missile and being able to put multiple different warheads on it. So just imagine this. Imagine you fire a nuclear missile into the atmosphere, and then that missile breaks apart where, let's say, 5 or 6 nuclear weapons come out of it and can hit different US cities. So this is the technology the Chinese are building, which is very advanced. They can hide it on submarines. Those submarines are stealth. They can build different types of nuclear weapons on bombers, hiding them on silos, then using those type of missiles. This is why the Pentagon is so nervous. And it's really a lot of this growth in Chinese military power. It's come under Democratic administrations during the Obama years, now happening in the Biden years. And the Biden administration is actually thinking about cutting defense, which makes no sense whatsoever.
No, and there's a lesson from the Reagan playbook. It's don't cut defence, if anything, expand it, but then actually do seek to negotiate. Is negotiation an option? Briefly, Harry.
No, unfortunately, we've tried many times under actually many different administrations to talk to the Chinese about what their nuclear strategy is, what they're doing with it, what's the purpose. The reply, there isn't any.
Okay. Our American guests always know how to make an answer when asked for very short. It's brilliant, amazing. Harry Kassianis, thanks so much for joining us with some, fairly chilling thoughts on what's happening with that nuclear arsenal being developed by Beijing. More on that to come. Mark Dolan's next.
Hello. Many areas enjoyed some dry weather on Friday, but changes as we head through this coming weekend. Rain will push its way southwards across the UK. Showers flowing from the north, but it'll be the strength of the wind I think we notice most through Saturday. So we look at the pressure pattern, then you can see high pressure towards the southwest. That's what's kept things mainly dry today. But towards the northwest, this area of low pressure, that's going to dominate our weather as we head through this coming weekend, bringing some rain, but also those strengthening winds, like I said. Already through Friday evening and overnight, we're going to see some heavy, more persistent rain spreading in across much of Scotland. But elsewhere, actually, some decent weather for Bonfire Night. Lots of cloud around, but mainly dry. Just a bit of patchy rain towards the west, and a notably milder night to come than recent ones as well. Last night, temperatures dropped close to, if not below freezing. Tonight, temperatures holding up well above freezing, 5 to 10 degrees. Now, later in the night, we'll see more persistent rain spreading in across Scotland and Northern Ireland. That will continue to push its way southwards through the day. But ahead of that, actually, a lot of dry weather first thing across much of England and Wales. Quite a lot of cloud, some brightness towards the east. But that will change, like I said, as this cloud and rain will sink its way southwards through the day. So quite heavy rain on that, like I said. Still dry towards the southeast, sunshine and showers following from the northwest, but for all areas those winds will strengthen with that rain band. Particularly towards the west, we could see coastal gales. A milder day to come across the board. As we head through the rest of Saturday into the evening and overnight, then that cloud and rain will push its way southwards. The rain turning quite light and patchy. Clearer spells following from the north, but it will be the strength of the wind we continue to notice. Those winds picking up as we head through the night across much of northern Scotland in particular. Here we could see gusts 60, 70, possibly 80 miles an hour exposure. A wind warning in force for that. Elsewhere, still quite windy, and that will keep the temperatures up, so another mild night to come. So we look ahead to Sunday morning then, you can see here still some showery rain across much of northern and eastern Scotland. That will slowly ease through the day, but we continue with those very strong winds across Scotland through much of the day. Elsewhere, breezy, yes, but it will be mainly dry. Quite a lot of cloud around towards the west, but a lot of dry weather, bright or sunny spells, particularly towards the east. Same changeable into the early part of next week. Some rain, particularly towards the north and west, mainly dry further south and east.